Part 1. The Silent Sentinels of the Valley of Death. The sun was a dying ember over the horizon of the Pennsylvania hills as Marcus Thorne hauled his tripod across the jagged labyrinth of Devil's Den. The air in Gettysburg did not behave like the air in other places. It was heavy and expectant, as if the atmosphere itself was a vast library of unrecorded screams. Marcus was a man who lived through the lens of a high-end digital camera, seeking the kind of shadows that history books failed to mention. He was not a believer in the campfire stories told by the local guides, but he was a believer in the texture of silence. At Devil's Den, the silence felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. The massive boulders were piled together in a chaotic jumble of ancient stone, looking like the bones of giants that had been bleached by the sun and scarred by the iron of 100,000 bullets. Marcus set his equipment on a flat rock overlooking the shallow stream known as Plum Run. History enthusiasts called this area the Valley of Death, and for good reason. In July of 1863, the water of this creek had run thick and dark with the blood of thousands. The Union and Confederate soldiers had fought a savage hand-to-hand struggle among these very rocks, and the bodies had been left to bloat under the scorching summer sun for days. Marcus adjusted his shutter speed and peered through the viewfinder. The light was perfect for capturing the deep violet hues of the dusk, but something was wrong with the focus. No matter how much he adjusted the lens, the center of the frame remained a blurred smudge of gray, as if a thumb was pressed against the glass. He wiped the lens with a microfiber cloth, but the smudge remained stubborn and cold. He clicked the first frame, and the electronic shutter sounded like a gunshot in the stillness of the park. When the image appeared on the digital screen, Marcus felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. In the background of the shot, standing between two split boulders, was a figure that should not have been there. It was a man with long matted hair and a tattered gray coat that seemed to blend into the granite. He was barefoot, and his feet were blackened as if they had been burned or frostbitten. He was not looking at the camera, but was staring down at the ground with an expression of profound and hollow exhaustion. Marcus looked up from his camera and scanned the rocks with his naked eyes, but the area was empty. There was only the wind whistling through the crevices and the distant call of a crow. He told himself it was a reenactor or a stray tourist, but the logic did not hold. The park had been closed for an hour, and there were no vehicles in the nearby lot. Marcus moved his tripod closer to the edge of the boulders, where the fighting had been most intense. He felt the temperature drop with every step he took toward the center of the den. The air began to smell of ozone and wet wool and something metallic that reminded him of a slaughterhouse. He aimed his camera again, and this time he saw three figures in the viewfinder. They were huddled together in a small depression in the earth. One was holding his side, and the black fluid of his life was leaking through his fingers. The others were looking at the sky with eyes that were nothing but white voids. They were not moving, but they were not still. They seemed to be vibrating at a frequency that made Marcus's teeth ache. He pressed the shutter again and again, as if the mechanical act of photography could protect him from the reality of what he was seeing. Each flash of the camera revealed a new horror. He saw a young boy, no older than 14, leaning against a rock with a wooden flute in his hands, but his mouth was sewn shut with heavy black thread. He saw a horse with its ribs exposed, standing in the middle of the creek, its eyes glowing with a dull and sickly green light. The landscape was no longer a national park, but a living wound in the side of the earth. Marcus realized that the rocks of Devil's Den were not just geological formations, but a massive storage device for the agony of the battle. The granite was porous, and it had absorbed the chemical signatures of terror and dying breath for 3 days in 1863, and now it was playing them back for him. The shadows began to detach themselves from the stones. They did not walk, but drifted like smoke against the wind. Marcus tried to pack his gear, but his hands were trembling so violently that he dropped his spare lens cap into a deep crevice. When he reached down to retrieve it, a hand that felt like dry parchment clamped onto his wrist. It was not a ghost in a white sheet, but a solid and freezing grip that possessed the strength of a vice. He looked down into the crevice and saw the face of the man from the first photograph. Up close, the man's skin was the color of a wet sidewalk, and his breath smelled of old earth and gunpowder. The soldier opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out except the dry rattle of a dead man's lungs. He pulled Marcus toward the dark opening between the rocks, and the camera fell from Marcus's other hand, shattering on the stone. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of gray uniforms and silver bayonets. Marcus felt himself being pulled back through the layers of time. The modern world was a thin veil that was being ripped away by the fingers of the dead. He heard the sudden and deafening roar of a cannon and the whistling of mini balls through the air. The silence of Gettysburg was gone, replaced by the cacophony of the bloodiest struggle in American history. He saw the smoke of the black powder rising like a wall between him and the parking lot where his car was parked. He was no longer a photographer documenting the past, but a witness who was being drafted into an eternal army. The man in the gray coat pulled him deeper into the den, and Marcus realized that the smudge in his lens had not been a flaw in the glass, but the shadow of his own future. Part 2. The Echoes of the Iron Storm. The transition was not a leap through time, but a violent immersion into a sea of noise and sulfur. Marcus Thorne felt the solid granite beneath his boots dissolve into a slurry of mud and gore as the silence of the modern park was annihilated by a sound so loud it felt like the sky was being torn in half. The air was no longer the cool breeze of a Pennsylvania evening, but a scorching wall of heat that tasted of charcoal and burnt meat. He tried to stand, but the sky above him was a ceiling of gray smoke through which the sun appeared as a pale and sickly disk. This was the second day of the battle, and Devil's Den was no longer a monument, but a slaughterhouse in full operation. The rocks he had just been photographing were now slick with fresh blood, and the air was filled with the rhythmic whistling of lead bullets that struck the stones with a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. He looked down at his own hands and saw that the digital camera was gone, replaced by a heavy iron musket that felt cold and oily against his palms. His modern hiking clothes had vanished, and he was now wearing a rough wool tunic that was stiff with salt and dirt. The man who had pulled him into the crevice was standing over him, and in the light of the midday sun, the soldier was no longer a translucent shadow. He was a boy of perhaps 19, with eyes that were bloodshot and frantic. He screamed something at Marcus, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of a nearby battery of cannons. The boy grabbed Marcus by the collar and shoved him against the base of a massive boulder just as a shell exploded in the clearing where Marcus had been standing only moments before. The ground shook with a force that rattled his teeth, and a shower of dirt and stone fragments rained down on his head. Marcus peered over the edge of his stone shelter and saw the Valley of Death in its true form. The area known as Plum Run was a bottleneck of human misery. Lines of men in blue uniforms were advancing through the tall grass, while the men in gray fired from the cover of the rocks. It was a chaotic and disjointed dance of death where no one seemed to have a clear view of the enemy. He saw a man 10 feet away from him stand up to reload his rifle, only to be knocked backward by a bullet that struck him in the center of the forehead with a sickening thud. The man did not scream, but fell like a sack of grain, his life extinguished in a heartbeat. Marcus felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized that this was not a vision or a dream. The pain in his shoulder where he had hit the rock was real, and the smell of the black powder was choking the life out of his lungs. The boy in the gray coat began to load his own rifle with a mechanical and terrifying speed. He shoved a paper cartridge into the barrel and rammed it home with a wooden rod, his hands moving in a blur of practiced muscle memory. He looked at Marcus and pointed toward the Union lines with a finger that was missing its tip. He was demanding that Marcus fight. Marcus shook his head and tried to crawl away, but the rocks seemed to be shifting and growing as if the den was a living maze that did not want him to leave. Every path he took led him back to the center of the fire. He saw the same scenes of agony repeating themselves in a loop of suffering. He saw the wounded crawling toward the creek for a drop of water, only to be crushed by the wheels of an ammunition wagon. He saw the dead being piled into heaps to create temporary barricades. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became unbearable. The smoke from the rifles created a thick fog that settled into the crevices of the den, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Marcus found himself huddled in a small cave-like space beneath a leaning boulder. He was not alone. 3 other soldiers were there, their faces blackened by powder and their spirits broken. One of them was singing a low and mournful hymn in a voice that was barely a whisper while he held a blood-soaked rag to his leg. The others were staring at the ceiling of the rock with the same white-eyed void he had seen in his camera lens. Marcus realized that these men were the source of the hauntings. Their terror was so concentrated and their deaths so violent that they had left a permanent scar on the fabric of the location. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes that were forced to relive these final hours for eternity. Suddenly, the boy who had pulled him in fell into the cave, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to clear. He recognized that Marcus did not belong to this time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph of a woman and a child. He pressed it into Marcus's hand, and his lips moved as he tried to speak a name. But before he could finish, a volley of fire erupted from the top of the rocks. The ceiling of their shelter was peppered with lead, and the boy was struck in the throat. He slumped against Marcus, his life's blood hot and wet against Marcus's chest. The black fluid was not the oil of a ghost, but the warm reality of a dying human being. The cave began to spin as the noise reached a crescendo. Marcus felt the weight of the granite pressing down on him as if the den was closing its mouth. He clutched the photograph to his chest and closed his eyes, praying for the silence of the modern world to return. He heard the sound of 1,000 voices screaming for mother and for mercy, and then a sudden and terrifying vacuum of sound. When he opened his eyes, the smoke was gone and the heat had vanished. He was lying on his back on the cold rocks of Devil's Den, and the moon was high in the sky. His camera lay shattered next to him, but his hand was still tightly closed. He opened his palm and found not a digital memory card, but a small, crumpled piece of paper that was yellowed with age and stained with a single drop of dark blood. The boy was gone, but the weight of his story was now a part of Marcus's own flesh. Part 3. The Debt of the Granite Graves. The moonlight over Gettysburg was a cold and indifferent silver, but for Marcus Thorne, it felt like the harsh light of an interrogation room. He stood, trembling in the center of Devil's Den, with the shattered remains of his career scattered at his feet. The silence had returned, but it was no longer the empty quiet of a park. It was a predatory silence that felt like a predator crouching in the darkness just out of sight. He looked down at his hand and saw the crumpled photograph of the woman and the child. The paper was brittle and felt like it might dissolve into dust if he breathed too hard, but the image was clear. The woman had a stern but loving face, and the child held a wooden hoop. They were a family from a century that had been erased by the wind, and yet here they were, held in his modern palm. Marcus tried to move toward the path that led back to his car, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Every time he took a step, the rocks around him seemed to rearrange themselves in his peripheral vision. The labyrinth was no longer static. He turned a corner, expecting to see the trail, but instead, he found himself staring into the same dark crevice where he had first seen the barefoot soldier. The air began to vibrate again with that low and agonizing frequency. He heard the sound of 1,000 dry leaves skittering across the stone, but there were no trees nearby. It was the sound of the dead moving. They were coming for the photograph. To them, that scrap of paper was the only thing that tied them to their humanity, and they could not let a living man carry it out of their domain. He saw the first shadow emerge from behind a boulder. It was the boy with the sewn-shut mouth. He crawled across the rocks with a disjointed and insect-like motion, his eyes fixed on Marcus's hand. Behind him came the others, the men with the white voids for eyes and the horse with the glowing ribs. They did not speak, but the air was filled with a collective psychic scream that demanded the return of their memory. Marcus realized that if he left the den with the photograph, he would be pursued for the rest of his life. The entities were not bound to the rocks by choice, but by the things they had lost. By taking the picture, he had taken a piece of their soul, and the debt had to be paid in full. He ran. He scrambled over the jagged edges of the granite, ignoring the sharp pain as the stones sliced into his palms. He could hear the heavy thud of boots behind him, even though the rocks were empty. He reached the edge of the den where the grass of the Valley of Death began, but an invisible wall seemed to stop him. The air was thick and gelatinous, as if he were trying to run through water. He looked back and saw the boy in the gray coat standing on the highest peak of the den. The boy's throat was still open, and the black fluid was still dripping down his tunic, but his expression was no longer one of exhaustion. It was one of pure and unadulterated hunger. He pointed a finger at Marcus, and the other spirits began to close the circle. Marcus looked at the photograph one last time. He saw the hope in the woman's eyes and realized that the boy had given it to him, not to keep, but to save. But there was no saving the dead in a place like Gettysburg. The ground was too saturated with blood to ever truly be clean, and the rocks were too old to ever forget. He understood that the only way to escape the den was to give back what belonged to the shadows. With a heavy heart, Marcus knelt on the cold stone and placed the photograph back into the deep crevice where he had found it. He pushed it deep into the darkness until it was swallowed by the shadows of the earth. The moment the paper left his hand, the pressure in the air vanished, the vibration in his teeth stopped, and the temperature rose back to the humid warmth of a Pennsylvania summer night. The shadows receded into the cracks of the boulders, and the sounds of the phantom battle faded into the rustle of the wind. Marcus stood up and walked toward his car without looking back. He didn't care about his broken camera or his lost lenses. He only wanted to be away from the Valley of Death before the sun rose to reveal the scars of the land. When he reached his apartment in the city, he went straight to the bathroom to wash the mud and blood from his skin. He scrubbed his hands until they were raw, but when he looked in the mirror, he saw a faint smudge of gray in the center of his vision. He blinked, but it stayed there. He realized then that the camera hadn't been broken by the rocks. It had been broken by the truth. He walked to his desk and saw his digital backup drive humming on the table. He plugged it in and opened the files from his night at Devil's Den. Every single image was gone. In their place were thousands of files named with the dates of July 1863. He opened one and saw the faces of the soldiers he had met in the dark. They were no longer shadows, but clear and sharp and filled with a terrifying life. Marcus Thorne was no longer a photographer of landscapes. He was now the curator of a gallery that no one would ever be allowed to see. The ghosts of the den had let him go, but they had left their images in his mind and in his machines forever. Behind the Red Door. Part 1. The Seal of Crimson Iron. The air inside the subterranean corridor of the colonial estate felt like a physical weight pressing against the lungs with the force of 1,000 years of rotting history. Thomas Miller moved with a calculated caution as dust motes danced in the flickering beam of his flashlight, which was already beginning to struggle against the oppressive gloom. As a restoration architect, he had walked through hundreds of ancient structures, but there was something fundamentally wrong with the blueprint of this particular manor. On paper, the building was supposed to terminate at the boiler room, but the reality was a hidden hallway that did not appear in any municipal record or historical archive. The corridor was narrow, and the walls were lined with white tiles that had cracked and yellowed like the teeth of an old man. At the very end of this passage stood a door that looked like a jagged wound against the gray stone. It was made of heavy iron and painted a shade of red so deep and vibrant that it looked fresh, as if the pigment was still wet after a century of isolation. Thomas approached the threshold and felt a wave of absolute zero radiation emanating from the other side of the crimson barrier. There was no visible handle or keyhole on the exterior of the door. Instead, it was wrapped in heavy iron chains that had rusted into a single solid mass, yet they were arranged in a specific geometric pattern that suggested a ritual seal rather than a simple lock. Across the surface of the red paint were deep gouges that bit into the underlying metal, as if someone or something had spent decades trying to claw its way out with fingers made of steel. Thomas placed his hand against the cold surface and felt a rhythmic thudding. It was a heartbeat, slow and heavy, vibrating through the iron and into the marrow of his bones. This was not the mechanical pulse of a machine, but the biological signature of something ancient and patient that was waiting for the seal to break. Terror began to coil around his spine, but the professional curiosity that had defined his career was a stronger force than his survival instinct. He needed to know what lay behind this anomaly before the grand renovation could proceed. He reached into his tool bag and retrieved a heavy sledgehammer and a chisel. The first blow against the rusted chains sent a shower of orange sparks into the dark, and the sound of metal striking metal echoed down the narrow hallway like a scream. Each strike felt like an assault on the building itself, as if the manor was moaning in protest of its secrets being unearthed. After a dozen frantic blows, the main link snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the chains fell to the concrete floor in a heap of dead weight. Thomas set his shoulder against the iron and pushed with everything he had. The door did not creak, but slid open with a sound of grinding stone that felt like teeth gnashing together. The scent that billowed out from the darkness was not the expected stench of a tomb, but a sharp odor of ozone and wet earth mixed with the cloying sweetness of jasmine. The space behind the door was an architectural impossibility. It was a circular chamber where the walls were not made of brick or timber, but of thousands of human bones stacked with a terrifying and mathematical precision. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair facing the far corner, and upon that chair sat a figure draped in a heavy shroud of black velvet. Thomas froze as his flashlight beam hit the figure, and he realized that the black fabric was not dusty but pristine, as if it had been ironed that very morning. The silence in the room was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own blood rushing through his ears, and then he heard a second sound. It was the sound of the black velvet rustling as the figure began to slowly rotate its head toward him. His flashlight began to flicker and die, as if the entity in the room was feeding on the electrical current. In the dying amber light, Thomas saw the red door behind him begin to swing shut on its own power without a draft of air to guide it. He lunged for the narrowing gap, but the floor beneath his feet transformed into a thick and viscous black fluid that clung to his boots like tar. A chorus of whispers erupted in the air, not in any language he recognized, but in a series of guttural clicks and hisses that felt like needles piercing his brain. The red door slammed shut, with a finality that shook the foundations of the estate, and the darkness became total. Thomas Miller was no longer an architect or an observer, but a guest in a room that did not exist on any map. He realized in that final moment of light that the door had not been painted red for beauty, but to mask the blood that had been seeping through the iron for generations. Part 2. The Weaver of the Marrow. The darkness in the room was not merely the absence of light, but a living, suffocating presence that felt like cold oil sliding over Thomas's skin. He fumbled for his backup light, his fingers slick with a cold sweat that smelled of copper. When the secondary beam finally flickered to life, the circular chamber had shifted. The walls of bone seemed to have tightened their circumference, the thousands of hollow eye sockets in the skulls now appearing to focus directly on him. The figure in the black velvet shroud was no longer sitting in the chair. The chair was empty, but the velvet cloth remained, standing upright as if supported by an invisible frame of wire and spite. The smell of jasmine had intensified until it became a physical weight, a floral perfume masking the underlying scent of something ancient and unwashed. Thomas tried to move, but the black fluid on the floor had risen to his knees, pinning him to the center of the room. He realized with a jolt of horror that the fluid was not tar or oil, but liquefied shadow, a manifestation of the house's long-buried grief. From the darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight, a voice began to speak. It did not come from a single point, but echoed from within the very walls of bone. The voice was a discordant harmony of 100 different tones, ranging from the whimpering of a child to the raspy command of a dying old man. It spoke of the Weaver, the entity that had been sealed behind the red door when the colony was first established. The Weaver did not eat flesh. It consumed the lineage and the memories of those who dared to walk the hallways of the living. The black shroud began to move toward him, gliding across the surface of the shadow fluid without a sound. As it approached, the fabric peeled back to reveal the entity beneath. It was not a monster of scales or claws, but a spindly construction of silver needles and human hair woven into a terrifying mockery of a woman's form. This was the Weaver of the Marrow. She reached out, a hand made of sharpened bone, and touched the wall, and Thomas watched in frozen silence as one of the skulls in the masonry began to glow with a sickly internal light. The skull began to speak in Thomas's own voice, reciting his childhood memories, his first day of school, and the face of the woman he had loved and lost. One by one, the bones were claiming his history, stripping him of the things that made him Thomas Miller. The architect realized the true purpose of the red door. It was a filter, a place where the house collected the essence of its inhabitants to keep the structure standing. Every brick in the manor above was held together by the stolen lives of the people who had called it home. The Weaver was the architect of this spiritual foundation, and she had been waiting for a new master of design to refresh the blueprints. She leaned in close, her face a blank mask of woven gray hair, and Thomas felt a sharp, icy sting in his temple. He felt his knowledge of geometry, his understanding of load-bearing walls, and his vision for the restoration being pulled out of his mind like threads from a tapestry. The Weaver was incorporating his professional expertise into the very walls of the chamber. As his mind began to fray, Thomas saw a vision of the manor's future. He saw the grand reopening, the wealthy guests walking through the halls, and the subtle, red stains appearing on the floorboards beneath their feet. He realized that the renovation he had planned was not a restoration of the past, but a trap for the future. He tried to scream, to warn the world outside the iron door, but his voice was already gone, captured by a jawbone at the base of the wall. The weaver began to wrap the black velvet around Thomas's shoulders, her needle-like fingers stitching the fabric directly into his skin. He was no longer a man standing in a basement. He was becoming a part of the upholstery of the damned. The heartbeat he had felt through the door was now beating inside his own chest, but it was out of sync with his life, pulsing with the slow, eternal rhythm of the house. Part 3. The Living Blueprint. The transformation was not an ending, but a horrifying expansion of consciousness. Thomas Miller felt his physical body dissolve into the structural integrity of the manor, as if his nerves were being rewired into the electrical copper, and his veins were being replaced by the lead piping within the walls. The weaver of the marrow worked with a rhythmic and silent grace, her silver needles flashing in the absolute dark as she stitched his soul into the insulation. He was no longer an architect, standing in a room. He was the room. He could feel the weight of the 3 floors above him pressing down on his spine, and he could sense the scuttle of insects in the attic as if they were crawling across his own skin. The black velvet shroud had become his new epidermis, a layer of mourning that bound him to the circular chamber forever. The weaver stepped back and surveyed her work, her blank face of woven hair tilting in a gesture of grotesque satisfaction. She had a new blueprint now, a living intellect to manage the house's hungers. Above him, the modern world continued its oblivious march. He felt the vibration of footsteps on the first floor, the contractors and the lawyers, the people who thought they owned the deed to this land. They did not realize that the house was a predator and that the red door was its mouth. Thomas tried to manifest a sign of his presence, attempting to make the lights flicker or the floorboards groan, but the house filtered his efforts, turning his screams of agony into the ambient, settling noises that the inhabitants would dismiss as the charm of an old building. Months bled into a single continuous cycle of sensory awareness, the renovation was completed, and the manor was reopened as a luxury hotel for the elite. Thomas felt every guest that checked in. He felt the warmth of their bodies against the carpets and the pulse of their lives through the furniture. The weaver remained in the basement behind the red door, her needle-like fingers constantly vibrating as she harvested these small, daily tragedies of the guests, their secrets, their infidelities, and their fleeting fears. She fed these morsels to the bone walls, and in return, the house glowed with a predatory beauty that attracted even more victims. Thomas was the processor of this energy, the forced administrator of a spiritual parasite. The cycle reached its inevitable climax on a stormy autumn night. A young woman named Sarah, a historian hired to document the house's lineage, found herself drawn to the basement. Thomas felt her curiosity like a sharp needle pricking his awareness. She had found a set of old keys in the attic that didn't seem to fit any known lock. As she descended the stairs, Thomas tried to push against the air to create a draft that would turn her back, but the weaver's threads held him tight. Sarah reached the hidden hallway, her flashlight beam cutting through the dust that Thomas now felt as if it were in his own eyes. She stopped at the end of the corridor, and the light reflected off the crimson iron of the door. To Sarah, the door looked like a masterpiece of antique mystery, but Thomas saw it for what it truly was, a scab over an unhealing wound. He felt her hand reach for the iron chains, which had been magically restored to their original, unbroken state. The moment her skin touched the red paint, the house groaned in anticipation. The weaver stood up from her chair in the center of the bone room, her needle fingers twitching in a frantic dance. Thomas realized that he was being moved. The house was using his architectural knowledge to shift the hallway, luring Sarah closer, making the door seem easier to open than it should be. He was the bait, and he was the trap. The chains fell with that familiar gunshot sound echoing through Thomas's very soul. The red door slid open, and the scent of jasmine and ozone flooded the hallway, a siren song for the inquisitive. Sarah stepped inside, and the black fluid on the floor rose up to greet her like an old friend. Thomas watched through the thousands of eyes in the bone walls as the weaver approached the girl, the black velvet shroud already beginning to unfurl. He wanted to tell her that the red door was not an entrance, but a transformation. He wanted to tell her that once you go behind the red door, you never truly leave. You just become the reason the next person comes looking. But his jawbone was silent, and the door slammed shut, painting the world in a final bloody shade of crimson. 7 minutes in Cell Block 4. Part 1. The Echo of the Iron Key. The Eastern State Penitentiary stood like a crumbling stone fortress in the heart of Philadelphia, a monument to a failed experiment in human isolation and spiritual breakage. Its radiating cell blocks were designed to force a man to look inward until he found a path to redemption, but most men found only the screaming void of their own fractured minds. Elias Thorne, a night security guard with a penchant for the building's darkest histories, walked the perimeter of Cell Block 4 with a heavy flashlight that cut through the thick dust of the corridors. Unlike the rest of the prison, which was open to the occasional tour group, Block 4 remained under a permanent seal of neglect and shadows. The air here was different from the rest of the facility. It was thick and stagnant, smelling of lime, old sweat, and a dry electric tension that made the hair on his arms stand upright. The legend of 7 minutes was a dare whispered among the veteran staff and the local ghost hunters who lingered near the stone walls. It was said that if a person entered the isolation cell at the very end of Block 4 and remained for exactly 7 minutes in total darkness, they would be granted a vision of their own future. But the catch was the silence itself, which was a physical presence in the block. The cell was built with a double-layered stone wall that blocked every vibration from the outside world, creating a sensory vacuum that stripped a person of their reality. Most who tried the dare ran out screaming within 60 seconds, claiming the silence had a voice that knew their darkest secrets. Elias, driven by a cynical curiosity and a life that felt like it was going nowhere, held the heavy iron key to the isolation door. He did not want a vision. He wanted to prove that the darkness was just empty space and that the fear was nothing but a trick of the nerves. He reached the end of the corridor where the ceiling dipped low and the stones were damp with the condensation of 100 years. The door to the final cell was smaller than the others, a heavy slab of oak reinforced with iron bands that looked like the skin of an ancient reptile. As he slid the key into the lock, the metal screamed as if it had not been turned since the prison closed in 1971. The door creaked open, revealing a space no larger than a coffin stood on its end. There was no bed, no sink, only a single slit in the ceiling, known as the Eye of God, which was currently choked with dirt and the pale light of a winter moon. Elias stepped inside, and the transition was instantaneous and jarring. The sounds of the distant city, the sirens, the wind, and the hum of his own flashlight were cut off as if a blade had severed his connection to the physical world. He checked his watch, and the digital glow showed exactly midnight. He clicked his flashlight off, and the darkness was absolute and heavy. It was not the darkness of a bedroom, but a physical weight that pressed against his eyes and his chest. During the first minute, Elias focused on his breathing, trying to maintain a rhythm that would keep his heart from racing. He could hear the rush of air in his nostrils and the rhythmic thud of his heart pounding against his ribs like a hammer. By the second minute, the sound of his blood flowing through his ears began to roar like a distant ocean tide. It was a sound he had never noticed before, a biological machinery that was suddenly deafening in the absence of external noise. He felt his pulse in his fingertips, and the sound was like the ticking of a clock that was counting down the seconds of his sanity. By the third minute, the hallucinations began to manifest in the void. His brain, starved for sensory input, began to invent light where none existed. Tiny, jagged sparks of blue and red danced in the darkness like dying stars. He felt a phantom touch on his shoulder, a cold pressure that felt like a hand made of ice and ancient earth. He reached out to touch the stone wall to ground himself, but his fingers met only more cold and damp stone that seemed to vibrate with a low frequency. He felt a sudden and irrational panic that the door had vanished and that the room had expanded into an infinite black plane where time had no meaning. He checked his watch again, but the glow was gone, and the battery, which had been full moments ago, was dead. He was now truly alone with the silence of Cell Block 4, and the silence was starting to whisper his name in a voice that sounded exactly like his own voice from a dream he had long forgotten. Part 2. The Weight of the Unspoken. The fourth minute was when the walls of the cell began to breathe in a slow and agonizing rhythm. Elias could feel the stone expanding and contracting against his back, a rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of his own heart, as if he and the building were becoming a single organism. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the collective psychic residue of the thousands of men who had withered away in this block over a century of sorrow. He began to hear their thoughts. a chaotic and overlapping static of regrets, prayers, and curses that echoed through the marrow of his bones. They were not speaking to him, they were speaking through him, using his body as a resonator for their ancient pain. He felt his own memories being pushed aside to make room for lives he had never lived and crimes he had never committed. He saw the face of a mother he did not recognize and felt the sting of a cold Philadelphia winter from 1845 when the prison was still a new and terrifying experiment. By the fifth minute, Elias lost his sense of gravity and orientation. Without a horizon or a single point of light, his inner ear failed, and he felt as if he were falling through a bottomless shaft. He was tumbling through layers of shadow and time where the air grew cold and smelled of wet earth and ancient limestone. He tried to speak to anchor himself to his own voice, but his throat was dry, and the sound he made was swallowed instantly by the stone walls, as if the room was eating his identity. It was as if the room was a digestive tract for the soul, stripping away his name, his age, and his purpose. He realized then why the prisoners of the past had gone mad within these walls. It was not the isolation from others that broke them, but the fact that in total silence, you are forced to hear the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime trying to hide or ignore. The silence was a mirror, and the reflection was a monster of his own making. The sixth minute brought the vision that the legends had promised. The darkness in front of him tore open like a piece of black silk, revealing a scene from a time yet to come in his own timeline. He saw himself, but he was older and gaunt, sitting in a room that looked remarkably like the isolation cell he was currently inhabiting. He saw his own hands shaking as he held an iron key, and he saw a figure standing in the corner, a shadow with a face made of gray mist and shifting smoke. The shadow leaned forward and whispered the exact date and hour of his death into his ear. The information hit Elias with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. It was not a warning or a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. The future was not a path you chose, but a cell you were already sitting in, waiting for the door to lock from the outside. He felt the weight of his entire life collapsing into a single point of unavoidable fate. As the sixth minute bled into the seventh, the atmospheric pressure in the cell spiked until he felt as if his eardrums were about to burst from the internal force. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, a cacophony of every scream ever uttered within the walls of Eastern State since the first stone was laid. The floor beneath him tilted at an impossible angle, and he felt hands, hundreds of small and cold hands, pulling at his uniform and scratching at his skin. They were trying to drag him down into the foundation of the prison, into the very dirt beneath the stone. They did not want to hurt him, they wanted him to stay and become a permanent resident. They wanted a new voice to add to the chorus of the silent ones who lived in the cracks of the masonry. Elias felt his grip on reality slipping away as the 7 minutes neared their end. He fumbled for the door, his fingers clawing at the wood until his nails bled and his knuckles were raw. He found the iron band and pulled with a strength born of pure and primal terror. The door resisted at first, held by the vacuum of the room and the weight of the shadows that clung to his back like wet wool. Just as the 7th minute ended and the silence reached its peak, the lock clicked with a sound like a breaking bone. The door swung open, and Elias tumbled out into the corridor of cell block 4, falling onto the hard concrete floor. The moonlight through the distant windows felt like a blinding explosion of white fire, and the sound of the wind outside was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He lay on the cold floor, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he stared up at the vaulted ceiling and realized that the man who had walked into that cell was gone, and something else had come out in his place. Part 3. The Silent Passenger. Elias Thorne quit his job at Eastern State Penitentiary the very next morning before the sun had even fully risen over the city. He did not give a reason or wait for his final paycheck. He simply handed in his badge and the iron key to a confused supervisor and walked out of the gates without looking back. He tried to return to the rhythms of his normal life in his small apartment, but the silence of cell block 4 had followed him home like a loyal and invisible dog. In the quiet of his bedroom, he could still hear the rhythmic pulse of the stone walls expanding and contracting. When he closed his eyes to sleep, he saw the gray misted face of the shadow from his vision, staring at him from the corners of his mind. The city of Philadelphia, once a place of vibrant noise and life, now felt like a thin veneer of color over a deeper and much darker reality that only he could perceive. He began to notice small and terrifying changes in his environment that defied logical explanation. His clocks would all stop at exactly midnight, regardless of whether they were digital or mechanical. He would find small piles of limestone dust in the corners of his rooms and on the pillow where he laid his head. Most disturbingly, he found that he could no longer speak above a faint and raspy whisper, as if a part of his vocal cords had been left behind in the isolation cell. It was as if a part of his very soul remained trapped in the masonry of Block 4, and the distance between him and the prison was shortening every day. He became a man of shadows, moving through the streets like a ghost in his own life. He avoided people and public places, fearing that if he got too close to anyone, they would hear the roar of the prison echoes still swirling inside his head. 1 year to the day after his 7 minutes in the cell, Elias found himself back at the towering gates of the penitentiary. He did not want to be there, and he had fought the urge for months, but his feet had carried him across the city while his mind was in a deep and heavy trance. The prison was closed to the public for the winter season, but the side gate was slightly ajar, as if the building itself was exhaling in welcome. He walked through the courtyard, past the crumbling exercise yards, where the spirits of the past still paced in circles. He moved back into the depths of cell block 4, and the air was warmer here, now almost inviting. He reached the isolation cell at the end of the hall and saw that the door was wide open, as if it had never been locked at all. He stepped inside the small, dark space and sat on the floor facing the corner where the shadows were deepest. He did not need a flashlight, and he did not need a watch to tell him that his time was up. He understood now that he had never truly escaped the cell a year ago. He had only been on a long leash like a bird tied to a stone. The vision he had seen of his older self sitting in the dark was not a future possibility. It was his current reality catching up to him in the silence. He reached out and pulled the heavy oak door shut, hearing the iron lock click for the final and permanent time. As the darkness enveloped him for the last time, Elias Thorne finally stopped fighting the weight of the stone. He opened his mouth and let out a long and silent breath that felt like the release of a century of tension. The bone walls of the prison breathed back in a perfect and terrifying harmony. The 7 minutes were over, and the eternity of the silence was just beginning to unfold. Outside, the city of Philadelphia continued its noisy life, unaware that one of its residents had finally found his place in the architecture of the damned. The eye of God in the ceiling was now clear, and the moon looked down on the man who had become a part of the stone. He was the secret of cell block 4, and he would wait there for the next man with a key and a dare to walk down the hallway.